The scuffed work boots felt alien on Julian Croft's feet. For a man accustomed to $1,000 Italian leather, the stiff, cheap material was a constant, humbling reminder of his new identity. Here, at the Aura Grand Hotel, the glittering flagship of the hospitality empire his father had built, he wasn't Julian Croft, CEO. He was Leo, the new maintenance guy, a ghost in a grey jumpsuit, hired to fix leaky faucets and unclog drains. His beard was a week overgrown, his hair was tucked under a grimy baseball cap, and he'd perfected a slight limp, just enough to make people dismiss him, to overlook him. And that was precisely the point. His father, Arthur Croft, had passed 6 months ago, leaving Julian a portfolio of luxury hotels and a legacy built on a simple principle. The foundation of a 5-star hotel isn't marble, Julian. It's the people who polish it. But lately, the quarterly reports told a different story. Profits were up, but so were employee turnover rates. Anonymous feedback spoke of a toxic work environment, of fear and pressure. The numbers were good, but the soul of the company felt sick. Julian had to see it for himself, not from the penthouse suite, but from the boiler room. For 2 weeks, he'd lived as Leo. He'd learned the maze of service corridors that ran like veins behind the opulent guest-facing facade. He'd shared lukewarm coffee with overworked kitchen staff and listened to the hushed complaints of the housekeeping team. He'd met the man at the center of most of those complaints, Marcus Thorne, the hotel's general manager. Thorne was a man carved from polished ice, with a smile that never reached his eyes and a talent for making people feel small. He praised his staff publicly with effusive, empty words, but in the private corridors, his voice was a whip-crack of criticism and condescension. Julian had watched him berate a young bellhop for a microscopic scuff on his shoes, and had seen the fear in the boy's eyes. Something was deeply wrong at the Aura Grand. The discovery came on a Tuesday, during the late afternoon lull. Julian was tasked with checking the fire extinguishers on the 3rd floor, a mindless job that allowed him to observe. As he passed a small, cramped linen closet tucked away near the service elevator, he heard a sound that was utterly out of place in the sanitized, professional silence of the hallway. A soft, choked sob. He paused, his hand on the metal handle of the extinguisher. He listened again. It was the sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard, a sound of profound, private grief. Against his better judgment, the one that told him to remain invisible, he pushed the door open a crack. The closet was barely big enough for one person, crammed floor to ceiling with stacks of starched white towels and spare pillows. Huddled on an overturned bucket in the corner was Elena Petrova, one of the hotel's janitors. She was a quiet woman, with tired lines etched around her eyes, but a persistent gentleness in her demeanor. Julian had seen her many times, always working, always meticulous, her movements economical and efficient. Now her shoulders shook, her head buried in her hands. A small, worn cleaning rag lay discarded at her feet, soaked with tears. "Elena?" he asked softly, keeping his voice low and gravelly, the voice he'd adopted for Leo. She flinched, her head snapping up. Her face was blotchy and red, her eyes wide with a familiar panic. The fear of being caught, of being in trouble. She hastily wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with a slight Eastern European accent. I will get back to work." "Hey, it's okay," Julian said, stepping fully into the small space and letting the door swing almost shut behind him. "It's just me, Leo. You all right?" She shook her head, a fresh wave of tears welling up. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in the lap of her drab uniform. "It is nothing. I am being foolish." "Doesn't look like nothing," Julian pressed gently, leaning against a stack of towels. He had to know. This was it. This was the sickness he had come to find, in its rawest, most human form. "Did someone say something to you? Was it a guest?" She hesitated, then seemed to crumble under the weight of her own sorrow. "It was Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely audible. He was doing his inspection." Julian's jaw tightened. "What did he do?" Eleanor took a shaky breath, fumbling in the pocket of her uniform. Her hand came out empty. That seemed to distress her even more. "I have a picture of my son, Alexei. It is in a small frame. I keep it on my cart. It makes me feel close to him. And he had his little toy soldier, the one he gave me for good luck. It was sat next to the picture. She stopped, swallowing hard. Mr. Thorne said it was unprofessional clutter. He said it made the hotel look like a flea market. He picked up the little soldier. Her voice broke. He looked at it and he laughed. He said, "What is this garbage?" And he threw it. He threw it in the trash bin on my cart, right in front of me, with the wet paper towels and the filth. Julian felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The sheer pettiness, the casual cruelty of it, was breathtaking. "But that is not all," Elena continued, her tears flowing freely now. "He said I was 3 minutes late returning from my break yesterday. I was helping an old woman who had dropped her purse. I was picking up all her things for her. He did not care. He said he is docking my pay. An hour of my pay. An hour is... It is milk for Alexei. It is his medicine." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate, hopeless shame. "I need this job, Leo. My boy. He is not well. The doctors. I need every penny. And Mr. Thorne, he knows this. He enjoys it. He enjoys seeing that he has this power over me." Julian stood frozen in the small, bleach-scented closet. The air was thick with the smell of soap and the sound of a woman's quiet heartbreak. He looked at Elena, a single mother being punished for her love, being tormented for a pittance by a man who earned more in a day than she did in a month. This wasn't just a toxic work environment. This was a rot that went straight to the bone. The image of Marcus Thorne, with his perfectly tailored suit and condescending smirk, laughing as he threw a little boy's good luck charm into the trash, burned itself into Julian's mind. In that moment, the disguise of Leo the maintenance man began to feel less like a costume and more like a cage, and the fury of Julian Croft, the son of Arthur Croft, began to stir. He knew he couldn't just fix this. He had to tear it down. The fury that had ignited in the linen closet didn't cool. It settled into a low, simmering burn in Julian's gut. He couldn't act immediately, not as himself. To do so would be to cut the head off a snake without knowing how far the venom had spread. Thorne was a symptom, but Julian suspected he was not the entire disease. He had to be Leo for a while longer. He had to dig. He finished his shift in a haze of controlled anger, his mind replaying Eleanor's story. He saw her face, the way her dignity seemed to collapse under the weight of Thorne's casual cruelty. That night, in his small, anonymous apartment, miles from his own luxurious penthouse, he didn't sleep. He sat at a cheap kitchen table and mapped out a plan. He needed more than one story. He needed a pattern. He needed proof. The next day, he changed his routine. Instead of just fixing things, he started breaking them in a way. A malfunctioning ice machine in the staff cafeteria, a flickering light in the laundry room, a stuck lock on a supply shed door. Each manufactured problem gave him a legitimate reason to be in the hotel's underbelly, to talk to the people who, like Elena, were invisible to the guests and to management. His first stop was the sweltering laundry room, a cavern of hissing steam and rumbling machines. He found Maria, a woman who had worked there for 15 years, her hands raw and chapped from the chemicals. While fiddling with the wiring of a fluorescent light, he struck up a conversation. "Mr. Thorne seems to run a tight ship," Julian said, his voice casual. Maria didn't look up from folding a mountain of crisp white sheets. "He runs it into the ground," she muttered, her voice low. "Last month, the main press machine broke. The official repair company quoted $5,000. Thorne said it was too much. He brought in his cousin to fix it for half the price." She snorted, a harsh, bitter sound. "The cousin used the wrong parts. The machine broke again a week later, and my friend Carlos burned his arm badly when the steam valve blew. Thorne wrote it up as employee negligence. Carlos got no compensation. He had to quit." Julian's blood ran cold. Did anyone complain? To corporate? Maria finally looked at him, her eyes weary. "And say what? That the general manager is a crook? Who do you think they will believe, Leo? The man with the fancy suit or the woman who washes his dirty linen?" She folded a final sheet with a sharp snap. "We all have families. We keep our heads down." Later, in the staff cafeteria, while fixing the ice machine, he spoke to Javier, a young man who worked as a dishwasher. Javier was saving up to bring his parents over from Mexico. He was always tired, but always working. "Overtime," Julian said, pretending to tighten a bolt. "You guys must get a lot of it, especially on weekends." Javier looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "The hours, yes. The pay, not so much," he whispered. "We are supposed to clock out on the computer system, but the system has been glitching for months. Mr. Thorne has us fill out paper timesheets instead. He says HR will process them manually. It is strange, no? The hours on my paycheck, they are never quite right. Always a little less than I worked. 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there." When I asked him about it, he just smiled and said I must have calculated wrong. Julian's mind raced. Paper timesheets, a manual process. It was a classic old-school scam. Easy to alter, hard to prove. "Who in HR handles the payroll?" he asked. "Brenda," Javier said immediately. "Brenda Farley. She and Mr. Thorne are very close. They have lunch together every day. She processes the papers he gives her, no questions asked." The pieces were starting to connect. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a bully, he was a methodical thief, preying on the most vulnerable members of his staff. He'd created a system, a partnership with someone in a key position to skim money and suppress dissent. The cruelty he showed Elena wasn't random. It was a tool of control. It was a way to remind everyone of their place, to keep them too scared to question the missing minutes on their paychecks or the faulty equipment they were forced to use. His final stop of the day was the loading dock, where he found an older man named Sam, who managed inventory. Sam was gruff, a man of few words who was nearing retirement. Julian offered him a coffee from the staff machine and asked about supply costs. "Costs are through the roof," Sam grumbled, taking a sip. "Funny thing is, our suppliers haven't raised their prices. I see the invoices Thorne approves. We're paying top dollar for everything. Cleaning chemicals, paper goods, you name it. But the stuff that arrives," he gestured to a pallet of generic low-grade toilet paper. "It's cheap junk. Doesn't match the invoice description. I flagged it once. Thorne told me to mind my own business and stick to unloading trucks." Fake invoices. Kickbacks from shady suppliers. It was a complete ecosystem of corruption. Thorne wasn't just stealing from his employees, he was stealing directly from the company. From Julian. As he walked back through the service corridor, the weight of it all settled on him. This was a conspiracy of greed and fear, orchestrated by one man and enabled by the silence of his victims. He thought of his father, Arthur, who used to walk these same halls, who knew every employee by name, who believed that dignity was the ultimate luxury. Marcus Thorne had turned his father's legacy into his own personal bank account, and he'd used human misery as his currency. Julian's path took him past the linen closet where he'd found Eleanor. The door was ajar. He glanced inside. It was empty. The overturned bucket was gone. The space was neat, orderly, and sterile once more, as if her tears had never been shed. But Julian would not forget. He couldn't. He now had the why, he had the how, he had the names. The investigation was over. The time for being Leo, the quiet maintenance man, was rapidly coming to an end. The time for Julian Croft was about to begin. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated moves. Julian, still operating as Leo during the day, spent his nights as the CEO. He made a single encrypted call to his most trusted executive, the chief financial officer, a man named Robert Davies who had been with his father for 30 years. He didn't give Robert the full story, only that he suspected high-level fraud at the Aura Grande and needed a discreet, off-the-books audit of Marcus Thorne's and Brenda Farley's financials, as well as a deep dive into the hotel's supplier contracts and payroll discrepancies for the last 2 years. "Consider it done, Julian," Robert had said, his voice calm and steady. "Do you need me to come in?" "No," Julian replied, "not yet. I need to handle this on the ground. Just get me the ammunition." While Robert's team worked in the shadows, Julian continued his charade. A strange sense of dread and anticipation hung over him. He felt like a coiled spring, the tension building with every condescending glance from Thorne, with every fearful look from the staff. He watched Marcus and Brenda having lunch in the executive dining room, their laughter echoing off the polished wood, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. They looked so comfortable, so untouchable in their little kingdom of deceit. Marcus, however, was not stupid. He was arrogant, but he had a predator's instinct for anything that disrupted the established order. The new maintenance guy, Leo, was becoming a disruption. He was too observant. He spoke to too many people. A man who was supposed to be invisible was suddenly present. The confrontation began subtly. Marcus started appearing wherever Leo was working. He'd watch him, arms crossed, a critical sneer on his face. He'd point out a microscopic speck of dust Julian had missed, or question why a simple repair was taking so long. It was a power play, a way of marking his territory and reminding the new guy who was in charge. Julian played his part, mumbling apologies and keeping his eyes downcast, but the act was wearing thin. The rage inside him was a living thing, and it was getting harder to keep it caged. The breaking point arrived on Thursday evening. Julian was finishing his shift, cleaning his tools in the maintenance workshop in the sub-basement. The door swung open and Marcus Thorne stood there, silhouetted against the hallway light. "Leo," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Got a special job for you tonight." He led Julian to the main kitchen, now quiet and gleaming after the dinner service. He pointed up at the massive, greasy stainless steel ventilation hoods above the cooking range. "The third-party cleaning crew cancelled on us," Thorne lied, his eyes glinting. "Corporate inspection is tomorrow morning. This entire system needs to be degreased and polished, top to bottom, inside and out. I want it to look brand new by 6 a.m. Julian looked at the vast expanse of metal. It was a job for a team of 4, with specialized equipment and at least 8 hours of work. "Alone?" he asked, letting a note of disbelief creep into his Leo voice. "I don't have the right solvents for that, or the high-pressure sprayer." Thorne's smile was a predatory slash. "Make do. I saw some cleaning supplies in the west storage cage. I'm sure a resourceful man like you can figure it out." He paused, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "You know, Leo, I've been watching you. You ask a lot of questions for a man who's paid to fix toilets. In my experience, people who ask too many questions are either very smart or very stupid, and you don't strike me as the smart type. So prove me wrong, get this done, or don't bother coming in tomorrow." It was a setup, an impossible task designed to make him fail, giving Thorne the perfect excuse to fire him for incompetence. Julian knew it, but he also saw an opportunity. As Thorne walked away, Julian saw Eleanor entering the kitchen to begin her nightly cleaning duties. She had seen the exchange, and her eyes were wide with concern. When Thorne was out of earshot, she approached Julian hesitantly. "Leo, you cannot do this alone," she whispered. "It is not possible. He is trying to get rid of you." "I know," Julian said, his voice a low growl. "The supplies he mentioned," she said, glancing around nervously. "In the west cage. They are useless. Watered-down soap. He threw out the good industrial degreaser last month, said it was too expensive. But," she bit her lip, making a decision, "but I know where the old janitor, the one before me, used to hide a few bottles of the good stuff. For the really tough jobs, come with me." Despite her fear of Thorne, despite the risk to her own job, she was choosing to help him. It was a small act of rebellion, a flicker of defiance in the oppressive darkness Thorne had created. She led him to a small, forgotten utility closet behind the walk-in freezers. Reaching behind a rusty water pipe, she pulled out 2 unmarked bottles filled with a potent-smelling amber liquid. "Be careful with this," she said, pressing them into his hands. "It is very strong, but it will work." "Elena, thank you," Julian said, his voice filled with a genuine gratitude that transcended his disguise. "You shouldn't have taken this risk." She gave him a small, sad smile. "He cannot take anything more from me." "What is he going to do? Fire me? Perhaps that would be a blessing." Her smile faded. "Be safe, Leo." Armed with the proper tools for the job, Julian worked through the night. The potent chemical cut through the grease with astonishing efficiency. As he scrubbed and polished, his anger fueled him. Every swipe of the cloth was for Elena. Every polished inch of steel was for Carlos with his burned arm, for Javier with his stolen wages, for Sam with his cheap supplies. He wasn't just cleaning a ventilation hood, he was scouring the filth from his father's company. By 5:45 a.m., he was finished. The stainless steel gleamed under the kitchen lights, looking even better than new. Exhausted but satisfied, he packed up his things. He had passed the impossible test. He had won. But as he was about to leave, he heard voices from the hallway. It was Marcus Thorne, and he sounded furious. And the other voice, quiet and trembling, was Elena's. Julian ducked behind a large preparation island, his heart pounding. Thorne must have arrived early for his inspection and found Eleanor. "I checked the west storage cage," Thorne hissed, his voice dangerously low. "The cleaning supplies haven't been touched, but the ventilation system is spotless." "How did he do that, Elena? Did you perhaps help our resourceful maintenance man? Did you give him something you shouldn't have?" There was a moment of silence. Then Elena's voice, fragile but firm. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Don't lie to me." Thorne's voice rose to a shout. "I know you helped him. You undermined my authority. You conspired with another employee against your manager." "He needed help," Eleanor said simply. "It was the right thing to do." "The right thing?" Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Let me tell you what the right thing is. You're fired, Elena. Effective immediately. Pack your pathetic little things and get out of my hotel. Your insubordination is no longer tolerated." There was a choked sob from Elena. "Please, Mr. Thorne. My son, I need this job." And then came the words that shattered the last vestiges of Julian's self-control. "Oh, I'm sure you'll manage," Thorne said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Now you'll have all the time in the world to be with your sick little boy. Of course, you won't have any money to pay for his medicine, but hey, you can't have it all, can you?" A deafening roar filled Julian's ears. The world narrowed to a single point. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. The time for Leo was over. He stepped out from behind the island. The rage that surged through Julian was primal, a white-hot current that burned away every shred of his carefully constructed disguise. The exhaustion from the sleepless night vanished, replaced by a terrifying crystalline focus. He saw Marcus Thorne standing over Elena, a triumphant sneer on his face as she stood, broken and weeping. The sight snapped the final thread of his restraint. He didn't walk, he stalked. His limp was gone, his posture transformed from the shuffling subservience of Leo to the commanding presence of Julian Croft. His footsteps echoed on the tiled kitchen floor, hard and deliberate. Thorne turned, his sneer faltering into a look of annoyance. "What do you want, Leo? I'm in the middle of something. Get back to your hole." Julian didn't stop until he was inches from the manager, close enough to see the flicker of confusion in his eyes. Julian's own eyes were chips of ice. "You're done," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl that was nothing like Leo's gravelly tone. It was the voice of pure, undiluted authority. Thorne blinked, taken aback by the sudden change. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "What did you just say to me? You're in no position to—" "You just fired the heart of this hotel," Julian cut him off, his voice lethally calm. "And you did it for sport." "She was insubordinate," Thorne blustered, gesturing dismissively at Eleanor. "And you're next. In fact, you're fired too. Both of you, get out! Security!" he bellowed, reaching for the walkie-talkie on his belt. Julian's hand shot out and clamped around Thorne's wrist like a vice. The manager cried out in surprise and pain, the radio clattering to the floor. "We're not going anywhere," Julian said, his grip tightening, "but you are." He began walking, dragging the sputtering, struggling manager with him out of the kitchen and down the pristine service corridor toward the management offices. Eleanor watched, her hand over her mouth, her tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Leo, no!" she cried out, but her voice was lost in the storm of Julian's fury. They reached the heavy, polished mahogany door of the general manager's office. A brass plaque read, "Marcus Thorne." Julian didn't bother with the handle. He released Thorne's wrist, took one step back, and drove his work boot into the wood just beside the lock. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet morning hallway. The door jamb splintered, and the door flew inward, slamming against the interior wall with a deafening crash. Thorne stared, aghast at the wreckage of his office door. "Are you insane?" he shrieked, his composure finally shattering completely. "You'll be in jail for this. I'll have you arrested." Julian ignored him. He strode into the opulent office, his eyes scanning the room. It was a monument to Thorne's ego, framed awards, expensive art, and a massive desk that was more of a fortress than a piece of furniture. On the corner of the desk sat a silver-framed photograph of Marcus Thorne shaking hands with a smiling Arthur Croft, taken years ago at a company banquet. Julian picked up the photograph. He looked at his father's warm, genuine smile, then at Thorne's fawning, sycophantic grin. "My father," Julian said, his voice dangerously soft, "believed in people. He believed that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who could do nothing for him. He would be disgusted. He would be ashamed to see what a parasite like you has done to his legacy." He let the frame drop. It hit the marble floor and the glass shattered, scattering across the room. The sound seemed to break Thorne's paralysis. Fueled by a surge of panicked rage, he lunged, not at Julian, but towards the panic button hidden under his desk. "Security! Get security to my office now!" he yelled. Julian moved with a speed that belied his size. He intercepted Thorne before he could reach the button, grabbing the front of his expensive tailored jacket and twisting. With a guttural roar of pure, unleashed fury, he shoved the manager forward. Thorne stumbled, his arms flailing, his momentum carrying him towards the massive desk. Julian didn't let go. He used Thorne's own forward motion, adding his own strength to it, and slammed him down. There was a sickening wet crunch as Marcus Thorne's face connected with the hard, polished surface of his mahogany desk. A stack of papers flew into the air. A crystal pen holder skittered across the wood and fell to the floor. Thorne collapsed, groaning, a trickle of blood starting to run from his nose. Julian stood over him, his chest heaving, the white-hot rage beginning to recede, replaced by an ice-cold calm. He leaned down, his face close to Thorne's ear. "You will never," he hissed, each word a shard of glass, "speak to another human being like that again. You will never again find joy in someone else's pain. Your reign of terror in this hotel is over." Just then, two security guards burst through the shattered doorway, their eyes wide, batons drawn. They saw the scene, the broken door, the dazed and bleeding manager on the floor, and the maintenance man standing over him like an avenging angel. "On the ground, now!" the lead guard shouted, advancing on Julian. But Julian didn't move. He simply stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, and waited. The chaos was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The two security guards, a young, eager man named Peterson and an older, more cautious veteran named Davies, advanced into the room. Their training kicked in, and they saw a clear-cut scenario. An employee had assaulted the general manager. "I said on the ground," Peterson repeated, his voice tight with adrenaline as he raised his baton. "Hands behind your head." Julian slowly raised his hands, not in surrender, but in a gesture to calm the situation. He didn't look at the guards. His eyes were still locked on the pathetic, groaning figure of Marcus Thorne, who was now trying to push himself up, smearing blood across his face. "It's all right, gentlemen," Julian said, his voice resonating with an authority that made both guards pause. It was the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed. It was not the voice of a maintenance man. Before Peterson could respond, a new set of footsteps hurried down the corridor. A portly, balding man in a rumpled suit, the hotel's head of security, skidded to a halt in the ruined doorway, his face pale. "What in God's name is going on here?" he gasped, his eyes darting from Thorne to Julian to his own men. "This maniac assaulted me," Thorne managed to spit out, dabbing at his bloody nose with his sleeve. "Arrest him. I want him charged. I'll see him rot in a cell." But a calm female voice cut through the chaos from behind the head of security. "I don't think that will be necessary." A woman in a sharp, impeccably tailored business suit stepped into the office. It was Sarah Jenkins, Julian's executive assistant and one of the few people who knew about his undercover operation. She held a tablet in her hand, her expression one of serene professional control. Behind her stood Eleanor, looking utterly bewildered. Having followed the commotion from a distance, the head of security turned. "Ms. Jenkins? What are you doing here?" He recognized her from her occasional visits from the corporate headquarters. "I'm here with my boss," Sarah said simply. She looked past the guards, directly at Julian. "Are you all right, Mr. Croft?" The name hung in the air, thick and heavy. Mr. Croft. A wave of confusion washed over the room. The guards, Peterson and Davies, lowered their batons, their expressions shifting from aggression to utter bewilderment. They looked from the composed woman in the suit to the man in the grimy jumpsuit. It didn't make any sense. Marcus Thorne, however, understood instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. The name Croft was like a death knell. He stared at the man he had tormented, the man he had tried to fire, the man he knew only as Leo. He saw him properly for the first time, the confident posture, the intelligent, piercing eyes, the unmistakable jawline he'd only ever seen in corporate portraits alongside Arthur Croft. The world tilted on its axis. "Mr. Croft?" the head of security stammered, his eyes wide as saucers. "That's right, Bill," Julian said, his voice returning to normal. He nodded towards the two guards. "Thank you, gentlemen. You can stand down." Peterson and Davies exchanged a panicked look and immediately stepped back, their professionalism warring with the sheer shock of the situation. Julian's attention returned to Thorne, who was now trembling, a mixture of pain and abject terror on his face. You're, Thorne stammered, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm the man who owns the name on the front of this building," Julian said, his voice devoid of heat now, replaced by a chilling finality. "I'm the man whose employees you've been terrorizing and stealing from. I'm the man whose father's good name you've been dragging through the mud." He turned to his assistant. "Sarah." "Ready, Mr. Croft," she said, tapping her tablet. "Mr. Davies from Finance has confirmed everything. We have 2 years of falsified payroll records, signed off by Mr. Thorne and processed by a Brenda Farley in HR. The discrepancies amount to just over $90,000 in skimmed overtime." Thorne made a small, strangled noise in the back of his throat. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice crisp and clear, "we've cross-referenced the hotel's supply invoices with the supplier's actual price lists. The invoices approved by Mr. Thorne are inflated by an average of 30%. We have statements from 3 different suppliers confirming they provided kickbacks directly to Mr. Thorne's personal account in exchange for the contracts. That's another $200,000 at least." She swiped the screen. "We also have a signed affidavit from a Carlos Mendez regarding an unreported workplace injury due to faulty equipment that Mr. Thorne refused to have properly serviced. And I have half a dozen other employees downstairs ready to give their statements about his systematic bullying and financial intimidation." The case was laid bare, cold and irrefutable, in the wreckage of the office. Each word from Sarah was another nail in Thorne's coffin. Julian looked at the head of security. "Bill, I want you to escort Mr. Thorne off the premises. His personal effects will be boxed up and sent to him. He is not to touch anything. I also want you to bring Brenda Farley from HR to my father's old office, the penthouse suite, in 10 minutes. She is not to speak to anyone or use her phone." "Yes, Mr. Croft," Bill said, his voice shaking slightly as he and his men moved towards Thorne. Thorne seemed to shrink, the last of his blustering arrogance evaporating, leaving behind a pathetic, desperate man. "Please, Mr. Croft. Julian, I can explain. It was a mistake. I was under a lot of pressure." "You made your last mistake when you decided to find joy in a mother's tears," Julian said, his voice cutting like a razor. "Get him out of my sight." The guards hauled Thorne to his feet and frog-marched him out of the room, his protests dissolving into muffled sobs down the hallway. The office was suddenly quiet. Julian, Sarah, and Elena were the only ones left. Julian's eyes fell on Elena, who was standing by the broken door, her hands clasped together, her face a mask of shock. She was looking at him as if he were a ghost. He walked over to her, his expression softening for the first time. The fury was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "Elena," he said gently, "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what he did to you, and for what you and so many others have had to endure in this hotel. None of this was your fault." She just stared at him, speechless. The kind, simple maintenance man she had helped was gone. In his place stood this powerful, commanding figure who had just dismantled a man's life with a few words. "Leo," she whispered, the name sounding foreign now. "My name is Julian Croft," he said. And I promise you, from this day forward, things are going to be different." He looked around the trashed office, a symbol of the rot he had just excised. The cleanup was just beginning. The penthouse office, his father's old sanctuary, felt different now. It had been largely untouched since Arthur Croft's passing, a museum of a bygone era. But as Julian stood looking out the panoramic window at the sprawling city below, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. He had changed out of the grimy jumpsuit and into a spare suit Sarah had brought for him. He felt like himself again, but a version of himself that had been tempered in the fire of the hotel's hidden world. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in." Brenda Farley, the HR manager, entered, escorted by the head of security. She was a woman in her late 40s with a severe haircut and an expression of nervous defiance. She clearly had no idea of the scale of the catastrophe that had befallen her partner in crime. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice professionally smooth, though a tremor of uncertainty ran beneath it. "Bill said you wanted to see me. I must say, the rumors flying around the hotel this morning are quite alarming. I trust you'll be able to get this situation with Marcus under control." Julian turned from the window and gestured to the chair opposite his father's large desk. "Please, Ms. Farley, sit." She sat, crossing her legs primly. Julian remained standing, a deliberate power move. He let the silence stretch for a moment, watching her professional mask begin to crack under the pressure. "The situation with Marcus is already under control," Julian said finally, his voice flat and cold. "He no longer works for this company, neither do you." Brenda's jaw dropped. "What? On what grounds? My record is perfect, you can't just—" "I can, and I have," Julian interrupted. He slid a file across the desk, the preliminary audit from his CFO. "This is a record of every payroll submission you have personally processed for the last 2 years. And this," he slid another document next to it, "is a log from the IT department showing that the digital time clock system has had 0 glitches. It has been functioning perfectly. You and Mr. Thorne manually overrode it, week after week, to steal from the lowest paid members of our staff." Brenda stared at the papers, her face ashen. All the colour had drained from her cheeks. "The police are on their way, Miss Farley," Julian continued, his voice relentless. "They are going to have a lot of questions for you about conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement and theft. I would advise you to retain a lawyer. Now, Bill will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings, and then you will wait for the authorities in the security office." Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. She was caught, utterly and completely. Without another word, she stood up, her entire body trembling, and allowed the security chief to lead her from the room. With the conspirators dealt with, the real work began. Julian called an all-staff meeting in the hotel's main ballroom for that afternoon. He stood on the stage, not as Leo, but as the owner, and he told them everything. He told them about his 2 weeks undercover, about the corruption he had uncovered, and about the dismissals of Thorne and Farley. A wave of gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then he looked out at their faces, faces he now recognized, faces of people he had worked alongside. He saw Maria from the laundry, Javier from the kitchens, Sam from the loading dock. And in the front row, he saw Eleanor. "My father built this company on the principle of respect," Julian said, his voice echoing in the vast room. "Somewhere along the way, under the previous management, we lost sight of that. That ends today. Effective immediately, we are conducting a full, transparent audit of the last 2 years of payroll. Every single employee who was shortchanged will be reimbursed in full, with interest. We are investing in new equipment for every department and implementing a new, truly anonymous system for reporting grievances that will be monitored directly by my office." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But policies and systems aren't enough. We need to rebuild the trust that was broken. We need to ensure that the voice of the staff is not just heard, but is a vital part of how this hotel is run." He looked directly at Elena. "That is why I am creating a new position, head of the Employee Welfare Committee. This person's sole responsibility will be to be the advocate for the staff, to ensure fair treatment, and to report any and all issues directly to me, with the full authority of my office behind them. They will be a watchdog, a confidant, and a leader." He smiled. And I have already chosen the perfect person for the job, a person who, in the face of intimidation and fear, showed courage, integrity, and compassion. A person who, when she saw someone in need, did the right thing, even at great personal risk. I would like to offer this position, along with a significant salary increase and a seat on the hotel's leadership board, to Ms. Elena Petrova. A stunned silence fell over the ballroom, followed by an eruption of applause. Elena stared at Julian, her eyes filling with tears once more, but these were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of shock, of vindication, of overwhelming gratitude. The other staff members turned to her, clapping, smiling, patting her on the back. For the first time in years, the oppressive atmosphere of fear in the Aura Grande was replaced by a genuine sense of hope. Later that evening, Julian was back in his father's office, the city lights twinkling outside. The day had been a whirlwind of terminations, meetings, and reassurances. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a deep satisfaction. He had not just avenged Eleanor, he had started a revolution. There was a knock on his door. It was Eleanor, dressed not in her janitor's uniform, but in a simple, dignified dress she must have gone home to change into. She looked like a different woman. The tired lines around her eyes seemed to have softened. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice still a little shaky, I do not know what to say. Thank you is not a big enough word." "Julian," he corrected her gently, "and you don't have to thank me, Elena. You earned it. You reminded me what this company is supposed to be about." She stepped forward and held something out in the palm of her hand. It was a small green plastic toy soldier. "I found him," she said softly. "When they were cleaning out Mr. Thorne's office, he was in the wastebasket by the desk. I believe he belongs to you now." Julian looked down at the tiny figure. It was cheap, scuffed, and utterly insignificant to anyone else in the world. But to him it was a symbol of everything that had happened. It was a symbol of cruelty, but also of a mother's love. It was a symbol of the fight he had just won and the responsibility he now carried. He took the toy soldier from her hand, its plastic shape warm in his palm. "No, Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think he belongs to a real hero. Your son was right to give him to you." She smiled, a real radiant smile that transformed her face. "My son, Alexei, he will be so happy. I can finally afford the new treatment the doctors recommended. You have not just given me a job, Julian. You have given my family a future." As she left, Julian walked back to the window, the toy soldier clutched in his hand. He looked down at the tiny figure, then out at the glittering empire his father had built. He finally understood. The foundation wasn't marble or steel, it was people like Elena. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure he never forgot it.